On this day, August 1803, a ship arrived off the coast of St. Simon's Island, Georgia. It carried a human cargo, men and women captured from the Kingdom of Benin in West Africa. They'd been sold into slavery, chained and beaten during the journey across the Atlantic. But the Africans on board carried a fierce belief that death was better than chains. As they were forced ashore, they rose against their captors, overpowered their guards, and then, according to legend, they did something astonishing. They marched to the edge of the water, and in one united act walked into the sea. Songs of defiance echoed as waves closed above them. Local accounts called it a mass suicide, but in Gula tradition, it was something more. Elders say the Igbo didn't die. They flew back home to Africa, their spirits refusing to be broken. This is the story of Igbo landing, and however you choose to remember it, the story spread among enslaved people across the South, becoming a symbol of resistance. The Igbo landing became known as the first major act of collective defiance on American soil, and yet today, it's rarely taught in history books. Why do you think that is? Let me know down below. Enslaved people in the U.S. had few rights, little access to education, and often not even their own names. Their stories were passed down orally, and their history has been kept alive through song, story, and ceremony. In the case of Igbo landing, the story has changed and evolved over time, and that's part of why it's so powerful. There are dozens of versions of what exactly happened that day in 1803, and because records from the time are incomplete or often contradictory, we may never know the full truth. But what we do know is that on that day, an act of resistance took place that inspired generations. Here's what we know. On August 1803, a schooner named the Ranger arrived at Igbo Landing on St. Simon's Island. Among the captives it carried were men and women from the Kingdom of Benin in West Africa. Today, Benin is part of Nigeria. At the time, it was a thriving and sophisticated society with its own language, culture, and system of government. But by the 18th century, European powers had begun to dismantle it, raiding villages, destroying farmlands, and selling captives into slavery. That's what happened to many of the people on board the Ranger. They'd been captured in raids and marches inland from the coast. Others had been born in Africa, but had never known freedom. The Ranger dropped anchor just offshore from what is now known as Fort Frederica. Here, traders and settlers awaited the arrival of more ships, including one that would carry the captives to South Carolina. While they waited, the Africans were held on the island. And here's where our records get hazy. We don't know exactly how many captives were held here, nor do we know what all groups were represented. But we do know that many of the captives were from the Igbo-speaking peoples of what is today Nigeria and Cameroon, and we know that they resisted. Some versions of the story say the captives rebelled aboard the ship before reaching land. Other versions say the rebellion began once they reached the shore. But whatever the case, the captives fought and overpowered their guards. With their shackles broken, they fled inland, hiding in the woods surrounding the island. Some stayed hidden for days, others weeks, subsisting on berries and rainwater. But eventually, nearly all were found and forced back to the coast. There are two versions of what happened next. In one telling, the captives were herded to the beach and chained to a wall. Guards stood by with guns, ensuring no one would escape. Then, one by one, the captives began to walk into the water. When the tide was low, this created a narrow channel between the captives and the land. But as the tide rose, the channel widened until it was all that separated the captives from the waiting ships. And still, they walked forward until the water reached their necks and the waves crashed above them, drowning out their cries. In another version, the captives weren't chained up, but instead were allowed to gather on the beach. An old man, perhaps a tribal elder, stepped forward and addressed them. He told them it was better to die than live in chains, and so they all walked into the rising tide until the water reached their chests. Then, taking a deep breath, they all dove beneath the surface and disappeared into the depths. In either telling, the water claimed the lives of the captives. But some versions say the captives actually flew away, carrying their spirit and their story back to Africa. And those stories have continued to inspire generations. After the alleged Igbo landing, similar acts of resistance were reported across the South. In 1811, more than 100 enslaved people near New Orleans walked into the Mississippi River as it flooded, drowning themselves rather than working for their captors. And in 1831, Nat Turner led a group of enslaved people in a bid to end slavery in Virginia. Although he was ultimately captured and executed, Turner's rebellion became a touchstone for abolitionists across the nation. Because although history remembers chains, it also remembers those who broke them. And I'll bring you more stories like these for as long as you keep subscribing. Thanks for watching.